I wonder, Henry, if I on that subject of difficult conversations, and the power of arts and culture, I'm also really struck that in the midst of this veil being sort of pulled away around inequality in all of our societies around the world, we then saw laid over that, the murder of George Floyd, and then the events that followed, both in the U.S. and around the world, around systemic racism, around the use of police forces and so forth, and it feels like that discussion has then also built upon the understanding of inequalities that arose out of COVID, and has forced us again into a very, very important space to have again a series of very, very difficult conversations in all of our societies. And I'm really struck by how that has evolved in places around museums, around the questions of what do you memorialize through arts and culture? What do you prioritize? How do you make historical references in a way that includes all of these diverse perspectives? How you recognize the bias that may have been inherent in a lot of these spaces? And I'd just be really interested in how you see that, not just now, but how will that continue in the post-COVID moment?
Well, I think, the George Floyd murder has highlighted for museums a real question. It's been a real wake-up call, because I think a lot of museums and other cultural institutions have had to face the question, have we done enough? Is our programming actually reflective of the diversity that lies within not only our societies, but also world culture? And I think that if you look at museums, traditionally they haven't. When you look even at the origins of museums and the origins of types of museums, they've always tended to focus on the Western or the Far Eastern and neglected what happens in the rest of the world. And this is something that, in truth, museums have been grappling with probably for the last couple decades. But it's a moment like this that makes museums have to really look into themselves and do a bit of navel gazing and say, why haven't we done enough? Is it because we don't have enough diversity within our workplaces? Is it because, as a museum, we've always focused on one area, but now we have to launch into others? I think that all cultural institutions have had to grapple with this in recent weeks. And if a museum can't say that they've actually been looking at the broader picture, now's the time when they actually have to start doing some shifting and look at how, not just in the immediate time, but in the long term, forever, that they actually do address the diversity issues that they may not have done so before. And it's not just a question of whether a museum has done it, it's a question of why. Why do you do it? And I think the reason you do it is because as public institutions, museums and other cultural institutions are one of a handful of organizations that can actually do this credibly, with authority, with compassion, and also with a sensitive mindset. That's one of the roles that museums do have to play. And that's something which I think this current set of issues has really thrown up into the forefront.
And there's an opportunity to be restorative. And I think it's also important as museums and other institutions undertake these journeys to talk about the reflections that are happening inside institutions in a way that enables everyone to learn from it, because these are all different journeys from different institutions and individuals. And one of the things that is so insidious about systemic racism, as an example, is the fact that it is invisible to those who aren't experiencing it in that way. And so part of these journeys and reflections help to make it visible to those who need to be allies in the journey ahead, right? So to try and really help everyone understand why these perspectives had been marginalized, why certain approaches had been taken, and to really try and unpack that so that people don't just see statue coming down or a monument being changed, but they understand the thinking behind it, and they understand the troubled history that may have gone into that, and what you're trying to do to restore a sense of collective between maybe groups that had been divided, groups that have long-standing historical tensions and trying to use those as moments, as we were talking about earlier, of connection, of dialogue, and not just saying, well, let's just change what we've done, but really think about why we're changing it and how we're engaging other viewpoints. One of the things we spend a lot of time on in a lot of our work is the notion of unconscious bias, of really questioning ourselves why you assume one thing about one group or individual, or why you hold a particular worldview, so that you yourself can understand that we're all collections of biases. I mean, that's part of just who we all are as people. But if we can be more self-reflective on that, I think we can all be better as we move forward in this.
Absolutely. And again, I think that when you look again at the arts and culture world, you know, we've had to come to face with the unconscious biases that have actually been part of the field from its very beginning. The fact that, you know, there's fine art and then there's ethnography, and they were kept as completely separate things. And one was elevated, the other was kind of put down to a second level. And, you know, that's been there from, you know, the beginnings of the field in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And so I think there's a lot of navel gazing we have to do, and again, navel gazing isn't strong enough. There's a lot of reconciliation we need to do within ourselves intellectually, but also practically. And that's something that I think is very much part and parcel of what museum people have to focus on at this very critical moment in time.
I have to say that thinking about how we understand our own history as towards how we move forward, so many of the amazing art exhibitions that I've been to throughout my life have taught me different perspectives on history through the views of the marginalized, or really trying to say what's missing from this picture. I think, again, to Deborah Ahenkora and her lecture last year, you know, she talks about reading Nancy Drew when she was a little girl and feeling that it was somehow incongruous that she was relating so closely to a blonde girl from upstate New York when she was a young girl in Ghana, and being constantly told you can't be the blonde girl from upstate New York. That was particularly powerful for me because I was the blonde girl from British Columbia, and I loved beyond everything. And it was such a reminder that when I was 8, I didn't see what was missing.
Yeah.
Like me. And it's just so powerful now to see so much discussion in the arts and culture communities, and not just in museums, but on television and on the radio, that it's everywhere around us now, to really start to make the invisible visible to all of us, so that we have a collective understanding of the diversity of histories and experiences and perspectives around us. It's incredibly powerful, and I think it touches us in a way that the intellectual doesn't always. That there's something about the heart with arts and culture that is particularly powerful.
Correct. And I think that there's a wonderful opportunity that's at present, which again helps with generational changes. And I think that generation by generation, there is an increased appreciation, understanding, but also practical knowledge of how to actually eradicate systematic discrimination and bias. And there's no question that, you know, with what is going on right now, this younger generation, they embrace it. They truly understand the importance of this. And I think, if anything, it's for older generations to understand how, you know, they have to also reflect upon their own biases. And again, the arts are a wonderful way of exposing this, of being able to showcase the fact that this diversity exists, and also, you know, the exploration of those commonalities. I think it's also very interesting to look at how historically you can see these sort of waves happening from time to time. Where even the whole question about taking down statues, it's nothing new, but it does reflect the fact that whenever you do have these moments of taking down statues, or what we call in the field damnatio memoriae, erasing the past, you know, this is not just censorship. It's actually reflective of changes in societies and changes in societal behaviors and attitudes. And I think that there's no question that we're on one of these inflection points right now. And I look back at all of the other cases that I can remember of the past. It's amazing the changes that can come about. And again, institutions like GCP and the museum, I think we have a tremendous role to play in this. And I'd love to see exhibitions that come out that actually address issues like this. I mean, the whole idea of about colonialism, of inherent bias, again, this is something that actually, given the nature of our times, would be an amazing exploration, either through exhibitions or through debates and lectures and talks, because again, I think that it will showcase the fact that actually a lot of this has been on the minds of the professionals. It takes a crisis like this for us to actually bring this out into the public and accelerate the pace of discussion and change.
Absolutely, and I think one of the really critical roles that both the museum and the Global Center need to play in this is continuing the conversation. I always worry that in a moment of crisis, we're all talking about Black Lives Matter and racism, but then tomorrow we'll have moved on to something else, and we can't move on. We have to continue to have the difficult conversations and to push forward that kind of understanding around the power of pluralism, the power of coming together, and the power of seeing these extraordinary differences around us. I just sort of thinking as a final reflection on your comment about the younger generation. My son the other day said to me, he said, "Mommy, I don't think I want to live in North America when I'm older, because Black people get bullied here, and that's right. And so I want to go somewhere else, and I want to go back to Kenya." And I said, you know, people are being bullied in Kenya as well for a whole bunch of other reasons, sometimes the color of their skin, but a whole bunch of other reasons as well. And you can't get away from it, and you can't look away. And what your job is to be an ally and to help make that change. And I think that these issues are, as you were saying before, around our own dinner tables today, having a very powerful effect, and one that I really hope is lasting. I have a feeling that there's a lot of work that the museum and the Global Center can be doing together, as you say, on both exhibitions and dialogues around these issues in the months and years to come.